I rise to offer maybe a slightly different perspective on the state budget that is before us. I know that sometimes, certainly serving in the minority, we end up having to make a difficult choice on whether we're going to support or oppose, some of the big bills that come before us, and nothing is bigger than the state budget. But when I saw this document originally, I knew immediately I was not going to support it. And I certainly respect my colleagues, my Republican colleagues that are going to support the bill. But I also would caution anyone who's listening to recognize that sometimes when we adopt something as our own, we tend to look at it with some rose-colored glasses. And I'm here to kind of paint as clear a picture I can about what is happening as possible. The state budget is arguably the most important thing that we do here in this chamber. It's certainly the most far-reaching bill that we vote on. And it's also one where I think you can see a clear distinction between political viewpoints on the left and the right. And those viewpoints, for folks who watch politics, who understand politics, they know. On the left, the solution always tends to be more government intervention and more government involved in your life, more government spending, more government taxes, but also more benefits from the government. And for people on the right, like myself, I believe in less government. I believe that the government should take less from people, and consequently that would mean less benefits from the government. But I also believe that government is not the most effective way to solve problems. Ironically, today is the anniversary of the passing of former President Ronald Reagan. And he was famous for saying that the government is often something that stands in the way of progress. And I believe that also. A state budget is more than just a vision, of course. It's that, but it's also a plan. It's a plan for how we're going to get through, in Connecticut, where we have a 2-year budget cycle, how we're going to get through the next 2 years of taking care of our obligations and paying our bills. And I got my first look at the budget document yesterday. It's a very, very long document. It's 832 pages, I think, 425 sections, although there was an amendment that came out late last night that took some things out and put some things in, so I don't really know the exact length. And just for discussion's sake, this is the summary, printed to both sides, about 260 pages or something like that. We don't even bother to print the budget anymore in most cases because it's just too much paper to even get involved with. As I said, it's a plan and a vision. And any plan needs to have a foundation, a structure. And I think the most important aspect of that foundation is what we take into consideration when we start to craft a state budget. And the one thing that I'm forever trying to remind my colleagues in both parties is that we have to remember both sides of the equation. For everything that we add into this budget document that the state of Connecticut is going to take responsibility for, providing services, helping people legitimately. And I take nothing away from people that want to see those actions performed. But for everything that we do, we have to remember we are also simultaneously taking money out of the pockets of the people that we represent. And we don't give them a choice. They don't have an option, Madam President. It's so funny that people often, say when you're going to cut something from a budget, they say, well, Senator Sampson, how are you going to pay for that? And I always remark back, well, did you ask the taxpayers how they were going to pay for it when you decided to spend their money? And the answer is always no. No one ever asks. We just continue to spend, and the government continues to grow and grow. So this particular document, the budget, as I mentioned, is the whole document is 400 plus sections, but only the first 51 sections have to do with the budget. The majority of the rest of it is the policy that goes with the budget. And much of that is legitimate policy that is needed to tell the state and guide us on how the money is to be spent. But I'll note that there are also a great many items in this budget document that don't belong in here. There are policy items that are unrelated to the budget itself that are in this document that do not belong here. There are items that pass through one chamber after going through a committee process, but have yet to pass through the other chamber. And rather than going through that aggravation, apparently, the majority said, no, we'll just stick it in the budget. And that way it'll get passed along with everything else. And I can tell you, Madam President, there is nothing more frustrating than that from my perspective, because I serve in the minority. In fact, I serve in the minority of the minority on many days. And I work very hard to do what I believe in this chamber. And sometimes that means that there are certain policies that I am very adamantly against. And I don't have the votes to stop them. I'm outnumbered. So I have very little on my side to give me the tools I need to prevent that from happening. But the tools are my ability to speak, my ability to offer amendments, my ability to filibuster if necessary, my ability to challenge the majority and their efforts on other bills, all in an effort to try and stop things that I disagree with. And that's what the system we're accustomed to, and everyone accepts that. But in recent years, the majority has been using the budget document as a mechanism to get those things that the minority and people like me are able to actually stop to pass anyway. It's a tremendous frustration. It's like, why even bother here? Why have a committee process? Why even go through individual votes if you're just going to have one giant bill, nearly 1,000 pages with lots of different unrelated policy in it, and vote on it all in one shot? It makes a mockery of the process. It makes a mockery of this body. I'm going to just talk about a few things. As I said, lots and lots of sections. And we could talk at length about every one of them, but I just grabbed a few that I thought were worth mentioning. And I'm going to jump all the way ahead to section 122, which is a section that has to do with provisions of the Clean Slate program. And honestly, taking a quick look at it, I don't even think it's a bad provision. But nonetheless, this is a modification of a policy that erases criminal records, something that we debated in this chamber ad nauseum. Numerous bills. In fact, we passed a bill, and then it had to get fixed down in the House, and then it came back here, and we passed another bill, and then we came back, and we did another bill after that, and we've been modifying that program ever since. And that's good, because that's the way that system is supposed to work on that policy. We're supposed to debate that. We're supposed to use the legislative process for that. Here, we're making an arbitrary change to how DUIs are handled and whether or not they are erased after 7 years or 10 years or something like that. But it's not been discussed. It's not been debated. I certainly didn't get a chance to debate it. It's just right here in the budget. Moving ahead to sections 137 to 139, there is an expansion of debt-free college, which some folks might think is a good policy, but I know from my perspective as a small government Republican, I just don't think that's the proper role of the state government, to take money from some taxpayers to provide free college tuition for others. I just don't see it. Sections 144 through 149. This is the Hartford Sewerage System Repair and Improvement section, and it looks pretty lengthy to me, even just looking at the summary of it. It says that we're going to require the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to use available funding to operate a program that gives financial assistance to MDC. And then it says it requires the comptroller to establish the Hartford Sewerage System Repair and Improvement Fund. And then it goes on to say the grant program will be created to help MDC pay for costs associated with repairs and improvements. But nowhere in the budget document was I able to find the total amount of the cost of this that will be leveraged against the taxpayers' revenue. So through you, Madam President, I'm wondering if the good chairman of the Appropriations Committee can tell me a little bit more about these sections, 144, through 149.
Thank you. Senator Austin.
Good afternoon, Madam President. Madam President, this is to be used within available funding through the Clean Water Funds, the Clean Water Act funds, and it would depend on the entire cost. No, I was a first selectman for a tiny little town that had a water and sewer system. And just to do the work in that little town, we had spent close to $4 million just to upgrade the sewage and the water systems there in 2 of the villages. Prior to my leaving that position, we did not get to the Hanover section, and that's $3.7 million. Those are 100-year-old sewer lines, but the Clean Water Act funds are where the dollars would come after an assessment of the cost, and I don't think they'd be able to do all of this work in one fell swoop. It would probably be a multi-year process. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
And thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer. It's more or less what I expected. And I guess the point I would want to make is just to confirm that, in fact, what we're suggesting here is that this funding is not largely going to come from our state budget but through other federal funds, taxes nonetheless paid by each one of us and the people that we represent. But the point is that this is a pretty substantial policy that we're putting into effect, quite a number of sections and some detailed, funding mechanism for part of the state of Connecticut. And I don't begrudge Hartford anything except for the fact that here we are in this budget document, which is supposed to be the document that is about the state's spending and something that affects us all in the state of Connecticut to develop the policy for the state. And here it is. It's more or less a place to put this language so that it doesn't end up having to be debated as an individual policy in this chamber. And that's unfortunate because I think that this is something that by itself would be a lengthy debate. It might go for a number of hours just to have this conversation. There is a grant program for Hartford residents included in that same section. It says set up a grant program to provide financial assistance to eligible owners of real property in Hartford to pay for repairs by flood damage. And look, again, same kind of thing. We've had other programs in this chamber. We take care of crumbling foundations and so forth. But those are rightfully discussions to have and debate through a committee process, through hearings and so forth. I don't know to the extent that any of this has been heard. Maybe it has, but it has certainly escaped me. I didn't know about this provision of this item in the budget until just last night, looking at it for the very first time. And there are a number of individual grants. Requires the comptroller to give a $75,000 grant to the Blue Hills Civic Association. And I imagine there are quite a few other small grants that are given away throughout this document, and things that really ought to be debated in full by the legislature, in my opinion. Section 150 is the LGBTQ Justice and Opportunity Network. I'm not really sure what that is, but moving on, the next section here. This one really struck me. This is sections 151 through 155. Use of the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Fund bonds, SCRF, which is the Special Capital Reserve Fund, for the Connecticut Baby Bonds Trust Fund. So for those listening, I want you to know what we're doing here, which is that the teachers in our state, they don't use our Social Security retirement system. They have their own retirement system that is managed by the state of Connecticut, the Teachers Retirement Fund. And for many, many years, there's been concern and focus on making sure that this, among many of our other obligations, is properly funded. And I think we're actually in pretty good shape in the Teachers Retirement Fund right now, so much so that we've set up a special capital reserve fund kind of as a backstop in case we end up having a problem in the future. We can go into that money and fulfill our responsibility to the Teachers Retirement Fund. Well, in this budget document, what is happening is the proponents are going to go into that fund specified for teachers' retirement and use it to fund the baby bonds program. Something that not everyone supported, something that I think has been somewhat controversial anyway. And baby bonds effectively is a mechanism by which we would be providing a substantial bond to newborn children in the state. I think it's up to $3,200. I don't know the exact amount, but that's what I have written down. And this is a beautiful and wonderful idea. There's no question about it. You know, government is filled with big and wonderful and beautiful ideas. But what they always leave out is the other side of the equation, is that for every one of these big and wonderful, beautiful ideas, the money has to come from somewhere. And generally speaking, it comes out of the pocket of taxpayers. So here we're talking about money that has come out of the pocket of taxpayers and has been placed in a spot to make sure that we are going to fulfill our obligation to teachers' retirements. And instead, it's being used for this other baby bonds program. And I don't think that's the most responsible thing to do with this money, Madam President. I don't. And that's why I'm bringing it to attention at the moment. Just moving on. Sections 159 through 160. I just found this more of an interest rather than a real policy discussion, but it looks like the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity is going to be charged with creating a property tax abatement policy for grocery stores in food deserts. And I thought that was interesting. And I also noticed that there is a labor peace agreement required. Folks that know the definitions to these things, which is probably not the average person listening, they're going to realize how significant these items are and whether or not this is yet another item that I think belongs in the state budget. It is certainly something that I think would find some opposition, hopefully by the minority party. I would certainly oppose it. And yet it's something that gets tossed into the budget rather than going through a process by which we can really, truly investigate and understand the depths of what type of policy is going to be here before us. Moving ahead, sections 166 to 171. And actually, I'm sorry, this section was in the budget originally under those sections, but it has been since moved into the amendment that was drafted last night. Section 514. This is the Voting Rights Act, which is a bill that we debated in this chamber for 5 or 6 hours. I mean, it was a very intense debate, I think, involving a lot of very, very important policy discussion, and it took quite a bit of time. And I led the opposition to that bill. Certainly, I believe in voting rights and protecting people's civil liberties, but the mechanism by which it does that I didn't think to be appropriate, aside from giving the Secretary of the State what I consider to be a tremendous and extraordinary amount of power to go beyond the lawmaking power that we have as the state legislature. I just don't see it as the most beneficial way to eliminate discrimination in our world. I would love to achieve that, but this bill I don't see is the mechanism for it. But that bill should be being debated in the House of Representatives the same as it went through the state Senate. So it's getting the full and proper review and debate that it deserves. But it's not. It's right here, stuffed right into the end of the state budget. I mean, it was one of the bills that I was most adamantly opposed to based on some of the what I think are very dangerous policies that are contained in. Empowering the executive branch, empowering an elected partisan member of the executive branch effectively to override our lawmaking capability when it comes to election law. That's something worth debating and discussing, and yet the House of Representatives will not debate and discuss that bill. It will become part of this budget document. It's not the way we should be doing business, in my opinion. Section 172. This is yet another bill that I debated on the floor of this Senate a couple of weeks ago. This is about the reporting of apprenticeship data. And again, it's another bill that was not a consentable, everybody loves it kind of bill. There were people in this room that had concerns about this policy, including myself. There are definitely people in the House of Representatives who would have concern with this policy had it been debated on its own merits by itself as the policy for the state of Connecticut. And, you know, I'm tempted, Madam President, to get up here and talk about all of these bills and relitigate them and redebate them on this floor right now because they're in the bill that's before us. But I've already done that. And I'm disappointed that nobody in the House of Representatives yesterday in either party thought it was necessary to debate the Voting Rights Act or this apprenticeship reporting data or the countless other provisions that are in this budget that were separate bills before, because they should have. I'm not going to do that, but I am not going to let it go by without drawing attention to the fact that that's what should happen. There's a right way and a wrong way to make policy for the state of Connecticut. There's a right and a wrong way for our legislative body to do the people's business. Sections 183 and 184. I found this to be a remarkable policy item myself. The Student Loan Reimbursement Pilot Program, which certainly I've got no objection to a student loan program. This student loan program allows someone to earn up to $5,000 per year in grants, up to $20,000. Of course, this is on the back of taxpayers. There's two things about this policy that really stuck out to me, though. One is that you're eligible for this grant program even if you are already working and earning up to $125,000 per year. Imagine if you're your average citizen taxpayer in the state of Connecticut and you're making, $50K or something like that, and you're finding out that we're giving away your tax money as grants for other people's college education who are making up to $125,000 a year. That, for me, is not the wisest use of taxpayer dollars. It also strikes me as unbelievably unfair. A little investigation also showed me that there's $6 million in this program set aside to give out these grants, but the amount that we're also appropriating to administer this account, $1.2 million. So basically 20% of the money taken from taxpayers to give away to student loan grants to people making up to $125,000 a year is being used for administrative costs. I wish I wrote down a bunch of Reagan quotes. I'm sure I could have evoked some right now. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Maybe the most scary words any of us may have heard. 185 to 192, just a few sections having to do with the early voting provisions. Another subject matter we debated in here for many, many hours. And my concern over the early voting bill, more than any other single thing, was the fact that the whole purpose of early voting was allegedly to provide more access for voters. And I think the vision for the average person when they were choosing to vote for or against early voting was their image of what early voting might be. And the people I talked to, they thought, well, it's going to be a relatively short period of time, but a few more days for me to get to vote, maybe on the weekend. But I'm going to envision it to be just like Election Day, where all of the polls are open and I get to use that system. Well, the bill we passed doesn't look like that. The bill we passed basically says that we're going to have early voting for an additional 2 weeks, but it's only going to be in one centralized location in each town. Now, there are provisions in the bill that allow towns at their own expense to go ahead and expand those voting locations, but I just don't see that happening. I don't see our major cities deciding that that is a major factor. Certainly, places like Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford that have 25 or 30 polling locations are not going to invest the money or even be able to get the staff to be able to do something like that. And while I know there are a few different line items in this budget that address the cost, it's nowhere near enough. The Secretary of the State, the Democrat Secretary of the State, was quoted in an article I read this morning saying that she didn't think it was nearly enough for what was necessary to implement early voting herself. Section 210. Wait a second. That was removed from the bill. Thank heavens. That was something else from a housing bill that I don't believe belonged in this budget. Sections 271 and 274. Again, those items, apparently, some of these things reached the point of some consternation from our colleagues down in the House yesterday and they still had the opportunity to make some final changes and remove them. And good for them that they removed a couple of questionable sections. But moving on to 298 through 300. I wonder if the people of Connecticut would think that this is the proper use of taxpayer money to manage the state of Connecticut for the next 2 years, understanding that we are setting aside around 30, I don't know exactly the amount, around $30 million, maybe a little bit more, to provide for the expansion of free health care benefits to illegal aliens. Now, I understand these are children, and the exact policy, I think, is currently that we cover them if they are under age 12, and this will increase that to age 15 and under. But it will also grandfather children all the way up to age 19. That's a new expansion of health care benefits for undocumented illegal aliens. And I certainly am sympathetic to them, but the fact of the matter is I'm sympathetic to anyone who doesn't have access to health insurance in our state. And I'm thinking to myself, what $35 million might do in other places in our budget? How much money are we actually doing or spending on increasing Medicaid reimbursements, for example, for various things? That $35 million would go a long way into making sure that certain fields of care and medicine in our state were actually appropriately compensated. That's what I see. Also in this section is a study to expand the free health care for illegal aliens all the way up to age 25. I don't see that as a positive policy for the state of Connecticut. I would much rather see that money spent on citizens and for the purpose of providing tax relief to improve the lives of our citizens, or at least directing it to something that will have a direct benefit for the people that are lawfully here. No disrespect to people who are in the country illegally. I've spoken many times on that subject, and if I was in the situation many folks who come here are, I'd be crossing the border to get here too, but that doesn't make it right. It puts those folks ahead of people that are going through the process the correct way, and there is politics that is responsible for that. And this policy, Madam President, is just another flashing neon sign saying Connecticut is the place you want to come to if you are in the country illegally, because we will give you lots of free benefits, we'll give you free health care, we will have a no questions asked policy on most state benefits, we'll give you a driver's license, we'll give you in-state tuition. We ought to be, as a nation, fixing our border and establishing a mechanism for more people to come into the country lawfully. So they're not taking the place of people who are trying to do just that. Section 306, just moving on. This is the PCA arbitration process. I read through this, and it concerns me because these personal care attendants that are mentioned here, I think, fall into the category of folks that work on the Medicaid waiver program. And they are not employees of the state of Connecticut. And I've watched this whole process unfold over the last decade. But the Medicaid waiver program is for Medicaid recipients. Just to use the example I know, which is often, disabled individuals, they get a benefit. And this is an excellent program. It allows people to stay in their homes rather than having to end up in a facility somewhere. But they're giving the ability to use money through the Medicaid waiver program to hire someone to help take care of them, that person being a personal care attendant. But effectively, they are the employer. That person they hire works for them. But a number of years ago, in Connecticut, the majority managed to finagle a way to put PCAs into a state employment union. And I would say for nothing more than the ability to be able to collect union dues from them. And at the time it was done, it was very explicit in the law that they were not to be considered employees for any other reason but that. And here, in the budget, something unrelated to this topic, in my opinion, we are expanding the reasons and the criteria and factors that an arbitrator must consider when dealing with a decision about that collective bargaining negotiation, including wages, benefits, working conditions, and so forth. This is something that I would love to dive into and talk about in this chamber at length so that I can understand exactly what is happening and why. And yet, apparently the majority doesn't want to have a real discussion about it. It's meant to be pushed into a giant document the day before the last day of session for us to vote on. And in the House, they did it basically at midnight. It's an unfair process. And I'm sorry that my colleagues in the minority downstairs didn't see it for what it was. They might have had more opposition if they looked at this document a little more clearly, if they had more time to look at it. To say, this is not how we should do things. These items don't belong in this document. We should have individual debates on these subjects. Lines 315 to lines 317, this is, from what I can tell, it's just simply giving the Department of Revenue Services the ability to put a checkbox on your tax return where you can check it off to say that you want information about Access Health, which is another scheme that was sold to the American people as a way to give them an opportunity to get low-cost health insurance. But really what it is a mechanism for the majority to take more individuals and put them into the Medicaid program. Before Obamacare, before the Affordable Care Act, before Access Health, 10 years ago, there was just around 150,000 people on Medicaid in the state of Connecticut. Now there are over 1 million. How many people went from having no health care insurance, even though they were eligible to purchase it individually, to today? Almost no difference. We've done nothing to solve the problem of people not having insurance, unless, of course, you consider that putting them on state assistance as a benefit. That is not a benefit to them, and is not a benefit to the state, and it is certainly not a benefit to our future prosperity. Section 321, this is about inmates with gender incongruence. I hesitate to even dig further into this section. What this has to do with our state budget is beyond me. If we're going to start talking about topics like gender incongruence, that ought to happen here with a proper debate, proper hearing, proper discussion. But this is about the treatment and placement of inmates with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. I don't know that it changes it. I honestly didn't have time to dig in it too far. The following sections, 322 and 323, reproductive and gender affirming healthcare services and gender incongruence. And then 325, gender affirming care in Husky Health. Those are things worth having an entire conversation about as a legislative body. I don't want us to get too off track, though. What I'm trying to do is paint a picture of how we should be working on crafting a state budget and how we shouldn't. And my opinion is adding these items is not the right way to do it. Section 334, we can now allow the State Department of Ed staff to join the teachers' retirement system. I don't know if this has been floated before, whether this was a committee bill. I don't know where it came from. But that's something that I think is worthy of a conversation. Section 365. Of course, we continue the 10% corporate tax surcharge. It's supposed to periodically come up for us to be able to let it finally lapse. But no, the majority who wants to tout the tax cuts that they are alleging are in this budget certainly had no problem continuing that 10% corporate tax surcharge for 3 more years. Sections 410 through 412. This is a complicated section I had difficulty even make heads or tails out of, but it has to do with the Excel Center. I remember going back 10 years ago, one of the things in the, not 10 years ago, 2017, the great 2017 compromise budget that everyone wants to take credit for. Sure, it did some good things. It did set up the guardrails that we are constantly attempting to rely on. I think we've lost sight of those guardrails in some respects because we now use a multitude of schemes to avoid them. But back then, that budget, aside from doing those good guardrails, it also raised taxes extraordinarily, had $45 million per year for the XL Center, eliminated the property tax credit, which was once $500 in this state. I don't know what it's at now. Something that the Senate Republican proposal actually put into our budget plan to actually put that back. Because as was mentioned earlier, property taxes, I think, are one of the most regressive, but certainly the taxes that people point to when they say Connecticut is a difficult place to live. I know property taxes is on my list of things as I look at ways we should improve the state of Connecticut. Inside this budget, there's around $400 million that we're still receiving in the form of ARPA funds. I think that's about the correct number. So that's helping us, stay afloat. But those ARPA funds will run out at some point. And one of the things I've been concerned about and mentioned in the last budget debate was that we are going to at some point reach a cliff when we continue to use one-time revenues and we rely on major changes that have occurred. I mean, the state of Connecticut was effectively bailed out by the pandemic. Had it not been for the pandemic, we would be faced with some of the largest budget deficits across the whole country. I have no doubt about that. Billions and billions of dollars. But thankfully, we got billions and billions of dollars. We got billions and billions of dollars of freshly printed federal money. And we also have been benefiting dramatically from inflation, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. The amendment that came last night included other changes, several bills that would have been before this chamber and the House that came out of the committee that I serve as the ranking member on, the Government Administration Elections Committee, about changing certain limits for the contracting standards and so forth. There was an article from Kevin Rennie this morning about the rat that's in the budget, about the Middlebury warehouse. It's just not the way to put together a budget document, in my opinion. It's not just a garbage can where we throw in our pet projects and anything we didn't feel like we could get through both chambers the proper way, we just slide it into this document. And maybe, just maybe, that might even be okay if the actual core foundation and structure of the budget is actually good, but it's not. And I have no doubt that in the coming weeks there are going to be more policy items that will be uncovered that we don't know about just now, because no one's really had the chance to spend a really significant amount of time digging through 900 pages of budget statute. But the big issue with this budget is the same as it always is: spending. The choice that Connecticut is going to have to face before too long is whether we will continue to operate this way. Growing government and its monstrous appetite, or are we going to grow our economy and the freedom and wealth that will result if we did so? For me, that's the question that really matters when looking at this budget and deciding whether I'm a yes or no. As was pointed out, the majority and some of my Republican colleagues have indicated that this budget contains a sizable tax cut. But I want to get to the bottom of that right now. The first issue is inflation. We have been experiencing record inflation across the country for the last several years, and as a result of that inflation, everything costs more. Every bit of goods and services that people are purchasing are costing more than ever. And you know what happens when goods and services cost more? The taxes that we pay on those goods and services cost more too. And as a result, the state of Connecticut has been bringing in record amounts of tax revenue. Now, in my opinion, when that happens, you give it back to the taxpayers. We don't need this money. And folks that are bragging about a tax cut, in my opinion, should really think hard before doing that when they're recognizing that, in fact, they're not really doing anything other than giving back a small portion of the extra money that they have been taking because of the benefits of the inflation and the increased tax revenue. Because that's what's really happening. That would be like me telling you that I'm going to give you 10% off something I'm going to sell you for $100. But then when you come into the store to get it, I tell you, no, it's $110. Because yes, while there is some changes to the tax code that are going to give some people a very modest benefit, the fact of the matter is we're all paying more taxes someplace else. And the way you know that is the bottom line budget figure. It's the biggest one we've ever had, which means the state is taking in more taxes than ever. That can't be legitimately described as a tax cut. And I'll just point out that I have a chart that tells me exactly how much people will benefit in how much tax cut they will see. And for somebody that's making $35,000, they will benefit to the tune of around $164 for an entire year. That's how much they'll save in their income tax. But the question we all have to ask ourselves is, where else are we being taxed? Are we paying more sales tax? Are we paying more property taxes? Are we paying more taxes on fuel? The answer is yes to all of those things. Somebody making $50,000. $50,500 on the chart says that they will benefit by getting $270 less as their tax exposure. And those numbers go up to, I think, a maximum of around $290 for someone making $65,000, and then they begin to fall off until you reach the $125,000 threshold. So it's $100 or $200 for most people. And if I could say that legitimately we were giving somebody that much of a tax credit, I would vote for it, because I would vote for any tax credit for the state of Connecticut's residents. But I know that they're more than making up for it in other things that they pay taxes on. And it fries me when I hear, oh, the largest tax cut in state history. Baloney. If you want to have a tax cut, you've got to reduce spending. This state budget spends more than ever before. $51.1 billion total for the biennium. That's $22.1 billion for fiscal year 24, which is, as was noted, $918 million in increase, almost $1 billion in extra spending over last year, 3.8% increase. And then in fiscal year 25, that number goes up $1.8 billion, so almost $2 billion in the second year for a total of 22.8, a 3.5% increase. This budget spends more than what the governor asked for. It spends more than what the House Republicans asked for. And it certainly, most certainly, spends more than what Senate Republicans offered in our plan. I'm told it's 7.5% more than now. To me, that is a massive tax hike, not a tax cut. And we have had some of the largest spending and tax increases ever in just the last 10 years. I remember when I was first elected, I think the first budget that I was asked to vote on spent $17 billion per year. But that number included Medicaid, because we used to actually include our portion of Medicaid in that number, and I think it was around $4 billion. I was hoping that I would have time this morning to pin down one of the research staff to find out really what the net increase is between the time I first got elected, coincidentally the same election as Governor Malloy, to where we are now. And I would venture a guess that our budget and spending has come close to doubling in that period of time. Take out the Medicaid and all that business, which I know has also increased dramatically. I think for the general government budget, I think we've gone from around 12 or 13 billion to around 24. Or I'm sorry, it's 22. So maybe not double, but darn close to it. Spending. 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 That is a reflection of how much our government is actually growing. The size and scope of our government continues to grow. So let's ask ourselves, do the people of Connecticut benefit from this budget? Are they benefiting from the policies that we have been enacting in this legislature over the last several years? And for me, going back watching with a front row seat for the last decade, will businesses see this budget in a positive light? Will they see it as a change of direction that makes Connecticut more attractive? I don't think so. I wish the answer was yes. How about millennials? Since we're always talking about different categories of people in the state, how about millennials? Do we think millennials are going to say, wow, this budget is going to make all the difference? I'm going to graduate and I'm going to decide to stay in Connecticut instead. I don't think so. The first reaction I have is not just the fact that we have the highest indebtedness of any state, but the highest cost of living of just about anywhere. It's not a good reason for them to stay. That's what we need to be getting a handle on. And this budget doesn't do anything to reverse that trend. How about jobs? Do you think that there's going to be more jobs as a result? Will this budget find its way to creating more economic opportunity for people, millennials in particular, as I just mentioned? And I know we have an influx of some people. We have a lot of people moving in from New York City because, amazingly, they're taxed even more than we are. But what about everybody else? What about the seniors that are in each one of our districts that are barely getting by, who are faced with ever-increasing costs from everything that they have to buy? Even just, simple things, having milk and eggs in the house costs more than ever before. The electricity prices more than before. Gasoline more than before. All of these things are piling up, and government is more than before. We cannot sustain the monstrous appetite of this government without people here working and paying taxes. So we better be hopeful that there are enough people moving in from other, even worse places to make up for the exodus of people that I know personally who are leaving here for South Carolina, Florida, and Texas nearly every day. So what is wrong with the state? Why is all that happening? Why do we have such huge long-term obligations? Why are our taxes so high? Why are our energy costs so high? Why are residents moving to other places, southern red states in particular? While we are simultaneously attracting more illegal aliens and more low-wage jobs. I saw some chart just recently showing me how the job market has changed in Connecticut from being some of the highest paid jobs in the entire country to more and more low-paid, entry-level type jobs. Why is Connecticut still known as being notoriously hostile to businesses? There's a lot of reasons, of course, and we talk about them almost every day in here. I serve as the ranking member on the Labor Committee. Almost every bill that comes through that committee is a message to businesses that they are not welcome in this state. And I do everything I can to stop as many of them as possible. I've been more successful this year than in most, but sometimes they find their way through this chamber, through the House. Sometimes they find their way into the budget document. And this budget is just the same collection of tired policies that bring us down the same path. But if I had one thing that I would say that we need to fix, it's that we must become more competitive. That's what we need to do. We have to find ways to be more competitive as a state. It's too expensive to live here. There's too many taxes. The energy costs too much. Businesses say it's too expensive. I have a lot of notes here, but I don't want to repeat all of the same commentary. I just want to share just how concerned I am. I've been here a while, and I've made a lot of speeches in this chamber and also in the House of Representatives on countless topics, but I've always been focused on one thing, and that is trying to make sure that the quality of life that I had growing up is still there for the people that are growing up today and in the future. That's all I want. And every vote I take and every time I take to this floor and talk about any issue, whether it's trying to stop some bad anti-business labor bill, or it's how we handle our voting stuff, or it's crime or car thefts or something like that, it's all about the same thing. It's all about protecting people's rights so that they can experience the same freedom, have the same ability to pursue their own dreams that I have had. And it's all about recognizing that the number one impediment to that is this building and the bigger one in Washington, D.C. That's the impediment to the pursuit of happiness. The government has grown as big as it ever needed to be, and that happened a long time ago. And what we ought to be doing is working on ways to get it back to a more manageable size, where we only do things that we absolutely need to do. Most of what government does today is engaging in things that appear to be charity, helping people. I had somebody last night in the circle say we were writing a kind bill. People don't want kind bills. That's not what they want. They want freedom to be able to pursue their own paths in life. And sadly, we're making our country into something different all the time. And as government grows, government has more control and more power. And more power in the hands of a select few is the danger that I am trying to avoid for us. Because when you leave power in the hands of a select few, and you give them more and more power to be involved in more and more areas and arenas, they will use it, even if they are good people with good intentions and good hearts. They will use it. And they will decide what's best for everybody else. And this whole country was founded on the idea that we don't want anyone telling the people who are the boss what's best for them. They get to choose that. Sorry for getting off topic. The only way forward for this state is if we truly have economic growth, which means we have to make a real decision to start writing policy that instead of saying, if you're an illegal alien, come here. If you're looking for state benefits or government benefits in some way, shape, or form, come here. But if you're a senior citizen on a fixed income, you can't stay here because the taxes are going to get ahead of you and you're going to be forced to move. Or if you just retired from your state job and you've got a nice pension, there are way better places to live and spend it where you retire. Those are bad messages, but those are the messages that come from this building. Those are the messages in this budget. Until we change those messages, Connecticut will continue to decline. I want to be positive about the future. I genuinely do. I believe America's brightest days are before us. I really believe that. And I'm hopeful that people around the country look at Connecticut and California and say, those are examples of what we should not do. We should not empower government in such a giant way. It does not lead to the quality of life for the people that live there. This budget is in direct contradiction to the message that I think we need to send as a signal to businesses and citizens that Connecticut has a prosperous future. I've said many, many times in this chamber that every bill that we vote on has to be measured against whether it makes us more attractive and more competitive as a state. And if the answer is no, then we should vote no on the bill. It's also in direct contradiction to my beliefs as a Republican and an American, which is that government should be small, people should hang on to their own money, and they should decide how to spend it. It should not be up to us to take the majority of their money and then decide who we're going to give it to. often for political reasons. This budget just feeds the monster that has become our state government, and I just cannot vote for it. And I am sorry that there are not more members who see this as I do, who are willing to stake out a different path for our future and say no to business as usual. But I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective this afternoon. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator.